Tales from a Rural Police Officer by Unlucky Kentucky. Make sure you go show the author some love in the description. I'm an old man now, recently diagnosed with a terminal illness and given less than 6 months to live. I've had no children, though my dear wife and I wanted to so badly. She was eaten up with the cancer before she was 25. She had to have surgery that removed all of her female organs. They took the playground, but left the slide, so to speak. When I was 23, I went to the police academy in Louisville, Kentucky. I graduated with honors at the top of my class, and I was assigned a post in a little rural town that shall remain nameless. I will not reveal the name of the town, the county, nor the names of the suspects herein. I've wanted to tell these stories to somebody for years, but I was worried about the NDAs I signed when I took the assignment. What are they going to do to me now? Eat me? Take my birthday? Hell, I don't even know if I'm going to make it to my next birthday anyway. I will try to follow the rules posted on this forum as well as I can, but some of the stories I have to tell aren't long enough to constitute a full post, and some are related. So without further procrastination, here are the stories of a patrol in a rural area. My first strange call out was in May of '77. I was parked in a local truck stop, watching for speeders and irresponsible drivers alike. My God, it was a hot day. I was sweating like Satan's nutsack. I could remember right before the radio cracked to life, things seemed to change. I went from just plain hot and sweaty to being over the wheel in some type of primal panic. When the static from the radio broke through, I thought I'd shit myself for fuck's sake.
Car 75, come in.
Car 75, copy.
Car 75, dispatch has you parked at the local truck stop. Is that your current 20?
Yes, dispatch. That's my 20. Over.
Good. We just received a call from an anonymous citizen that claimed to see a big black big rig speeding down the road toward the old coal mine. Said the truck was all over the road, nearly ran over a school bus. Reports that the rig has some type of big bulldog hanging in the windscreen as an identifier. Would you roll to the mine and report?
Copy that, dispatch. I rolled my cruiser to the mine, lights only, speeding and driving safe at the same time, so I know it can be done, okay? I didn't ever stop somebody for just speeding. Anyway, I turned down the rural highway 3356 to the old Dolmer mine. The mine was just up the road. When I saw smoke coming from a rig, he had to have been absolutely rolling coal. There were 4-foot columns of black smoke billowing from the stacks of the old Mack truck. I closed the gap between the two of us, flipping on the siren, trying to get the driver to slow down and pull over. The road was too narrow for me to get on his side, so I couldn't force his ass off the road, and my presence behind him didn't seem to affect his speed. I looked to the driver's door to try to identify the driver, but the windows were black as the paint. At one point, we were traveling at 95 miles an hour down a 1.5-lane highway. No other vehicle could pass us. I called to dispatch and told them to please close the road at the other end. It took 3 minutes for 2 cruisers to go the short way around town and block the road. Now, we don't know if any other vehicles managed to turn down this road at that time. So, it's a bobtailing Mack sleeper cab and a police cruiser going almost 100 miles an hour down a narrow, twisty, hilly road in the middle of the fucking nowhere. The only damn thing on this road was a trailer park that we flew by, and the mine site that had been shut down for the past year that we were traveling towards. Very few homes were on this road at the time, thankfully. During the pursuit, dispatch advised and granted permission to immobilize the rig if possible. I unholstered my service revolver and steadied it out the window, at the outermost rear left tire. All 6 shots hit the tire. I watched it swell and distort each time, but it never even slowed the driver down. I reported to dispatch. I was told to refrain from any further aggression and to drop my speed to match the legal limit, since the guy had nowhere to go. I hated to do it, but, an order's an order. I backed off the throttle and allowed the truck to pull ahead. It slowed down too. I shook my head. I remember thinking something along the lines of, oh, this bastard's pissing me off now. As a side note, back then, it wasn't rare for the cops and the good old boys to rough each other up during an arrest. It was almost expected with certain subjects. I'll have to admit, I planned to warm this fucker's head. Could have killed kids on that bus. He would have killed any car traveling in the opposite direction on that road. As the pair of us slowed down, the black smoke emitting from the stacks took on a different quality. They shimmered like the heat inducing a mirage. It was odd. As they shimmered, I felt myself being drawn to the shapes and shit. I had to fight to remain in control of my vehicle. At one point, about 100 yards from the old mine entrance, the truck dipped down a hill, and for less than a second, my view of it was completely blocked. When I popped over the hill, it was gone. No wreck, no smoke. It didn't skid off the road, didn't pull off and hide. It was just fucking gone. Car 75 to dispatch, over.
Car 75, this is dispatch.
Dispatch, report on the subject from the pursuit on 3356. He has vanished. Repeat, the big rig is gone.
Car 75, the units on the other end of the road haven't reported seeing the truck, but have reported hearing it tearing through the coal mine. Over.
Dispatch, that's impossible. We haven't gotten that far as of yet.
Car 75, check and respond. Over.
I sped to the mine entrance. Since the place had been shut down, they installed one of those swinging iron gates at the entrance. It had been crushed in. The damage was old and it was pretty heavily rusted. So I know it wasn't the Mac. I proceeded to travel through the road, up the hill to the plateau of the mountain, which was the strip mine. The roads twisted and turned the whole way up, with several switchbacks, each at a 90-degree angle. No way a rig could speed up there. Hell, it was all I could do to not turn my boat of a Ford and not have to back it up to take another stab. I reached the plateau, and sitting on the edge of the dig, where the mining company lost the coal, crushed up against a rock was an old busted rig. It looked as though it had rolled down the mountain and had been towed up there and placed, just out of the way. I stopped my cruiser and got out and inspected. As I got closer, I could tell that the truck had burned. Most of the paint was fine and replaced by a couple of years of rust. I approached the driver's side of the mangled cab and was amazed to find the door open. The door jambs hadn't burned the paint off, and they were still as black as the coal I walked on. I stared at the wreckage for a moment, and that's when I saw it. A big silver Mac Dog flat emblem hanging from the top of the cab. Dispatch rolled over the other two cars to my 20 after I didn't reply to the radio calls. They found me, crouched beside the cab, staring at this blob of metal that I still have. I know I saw it as a bulldog, but when they arrived, it was just a misshapen blob of crusty aluminum. Nobody knew what to make of the call-out or the situation. We eventually reported that the rig got away. Later that year, I would learn that the truck driver rolled his truck with twin buckets full of coal off the side of the mountain one day. 8 years before I chased him down that road. I guess he makes the trip once a year. I was called out for it next year, but I didn't bother to speed after him. I just drove to the mine, and I placed a silver bulldog on the rusted hulk. I'm tired, guys. I've got better stories, but that one really weighs on me for some reason. Maybe it's the fact that I've seen the truck parked on my farm. Maybe it's the old age and the cancer. But it weighs on me nonetheless. Before we even get started, I want to apologize for the long hiatus on the channel. I'm going to be honest, I've been pretty burnt out on recording creepypastas after the last couple I've done because they've been longer. But I'm going to try to upload every Thursday from now on, and hopefully you enjoy it. Now, let's get to part 2 of Tales of a Rural Police Officer. Thank you all for your support, and the kind words about my last entry. I said there was more, and there is. Tonight, I'm going to try to get something heavy off of my mind, so this might be a long one. Buckle up, grab a few drinks, and get a good cigar. Let's get to it. This call still gives me nightmares. I can still smell the fucking place, too. Major and violent crimes are not, or at least weren't, that common where I was. Very rarely would things escalate beyond an average bar fight or a family reunion brawl. We would get a couple of murders a year, maybe a kidnapping. Lots and lots of plain and simple disappearing. The disappearances were usually chalked up to foolishly getting lost on one of the trails and not being able to find their way back out. We tried every single time to find them. Many manhunts and search parties went out. Never once did we find them alive. Sometimes we didn't even find bodies. Then, sometimes we would find bodies, without really knowing where they came from. At this time, I would like to dive into the story of the night. It was the summer of '79. I was on duty on a Monday morning, and I was still feeling the earth-shattering effects of a massive hangover. The Friday prior, I had pulled over a vehicle transporting 12-quart jars of straight moonshine. That wasn't good. We were in a dry county. So the perpetrator and I came up with a solution. Since she was young, had a child and no husband, she was doing whatever she could to earn some extra cash, including running moonshine for some nasty-ass people. Between the two of us, we hatched a plan. I would keep the liquor and actually pay for it. She would take the money back to the Shiner, and me and 3 other cruisers would storm the place, claiming to have seen them load the shine, and to know who bought it. No heat landed on the girl, and she became my house cleaner for many years after that. I made the mistake that first weekend to test the shine. Never again. I drank straight corn liquor without proofing it down. I was sitting at my desk in the courthouse, sweating right through my uniform, desperate to get away to cool down. The building wasn't air-conditioned at the time, and the only way we had to keep cool was a tiny desk fan. They made a lot of noise, but did not move a lot of air. So, when my phone actually rang, I was a little bit excited, hoping I would get an excuse to take a drive. The call was a distress call from a young woman. She reported being able to smell death and rot from her neighbor's home, and she reported that she hadn't seen her neighbors in several days. The caller reported that the neighbors were an elderly couple. She asked if I could do a welfare check because she couldn't get them to answer the door or the phone. I agreed. I informed dispatch I was rolling to a WC scene, and to have EMS on standby, just in case. In my experience, a vast majority of these calls were overly cautious friends and family. The people being checked on were usually fine. Sometimes folks just took vacations, and not telling the neighborhood was considered security. Simpler times, huh? I jumped to the cruiser and flipped the lights on, the siren too, mainly so I could just drive fast enough to get a good strong breeze in the car. It didn't take long for me to reach the address I had been given. The house was old and decrepit, needed a lot of repairs, but it was still habitable. As I approached the domicile, I noted the smell of death. I could instantly tell that I wasn't smelling a dead pet or even a dead deer. I was smelling a deceased human being. I radioed dispatch, telling them to alert the EMS in the county coroner, also to send out another car with a detective. I informed dispatch that I was entering the home and ended the transmission. I knocked loudly using my mag light to beat against the front door. I cut my hands around my face trying to peer inside, but the windows appeared to be painted. I couldn't see through them. Thinking nothing of it, I proceeded to check the other windows for a line of sight into the home. I found them all covered in paint, just like the rest. I made my way back to the back side of the house, looking for an unlocked door or window or even a cellar being open. I was met with locks, drapes, and brown paint on every possible point of entry. By the time I got back to the rotted back porch, the smell was nearly a physical being. I could almost reach out and touch it. I remembered the peppermint oil that the coroner gave us, and I ran to my cruiser to get it. I applied a very generous glob of it to my upper lip and nostrils. I radioed dispatch, telling them to check the progress of the coroner's arrival, and that of the backup. I was assured that they would be arriving in a short time. I decided to enter the home via the rear door, just in case I was terribly wrong about what I expected to find inside. That way, we could try to ensure that nobody would burglarize the home after we left. I mule-kicked the old wooden door just under the knob twice and the jamb shattered. The door swung open and violently hit the wall behind it. The smell rolled out like a sticky, wet fog of nasty. The peppermint oil was now doing fuck all to help the stench. As my eyes watered and adjusted to the dim bright inside the home, I noticed a sound. A constant droning noise. I knew what the sound was, but at the moment that hangover was truly kicking my ass, and my brain was in a deep fog. I made my way through the door and into the small cramped utility room. I made my way into the next room, which turned out to be the kitchen. I was using my flashlight to look around and I felt something warm and wet plop onto the back of my neck, followed by the intense smell of rotten human shit. I knew what it was, but my hand had a mind of its own, and I swept the nasty glob off of my neck. I tried to fling the stuff on my finger. That's when the realization of what the stuff was hit me. Putrescine and scatol. two chemicals produced when a body decomposes. Gagging and fighting back bile, I staggered into the dining room, where the noise I mentioned seemed to originate. Through teary eyes, I looked around the room. I almost wept when I saw the source of the noise. What had to be millions of flies and beetles covered everything inside the dining room. The ceiling was moving and fluttering. Although it took me a second, I realized that the flies and the bugs were what covered the windows. They were so dense you couldn't see through them. As I stepped through the doorway, the covering of bugs shifted out of my way. The few that remained in place got squished audibly under my foot. As they shifted and moved, I realized why they were covering everything. The walls, ceiling, floor of the entire dining room was covered in blood and viscera. I could see intestines smeared across the dining room table, fecal matter oozing in a greenish-brown streak. The walls were completely covered, as if somebody had taken the time to paint everything with the blood of their victims. I carefully made my way through the room, impervious to the sounds emanating from underneath my feet. The living room was attached to the dining room, and it was absolutely spotless. Not a drop of blood or anything to indicate the nightmare in the other room. The stairwell, which would lead to the bedrooms, was in one corner of the living room. I carefully made my way to the front door, unlocking it from my backup in the corner. I tried to radio dispatch, but my portable wouldn't reach out. I was only receiving static. I carefully ascended the steps, making my way upstairs. At the top of the landing was 3 doors. One directly in front of me, one on my left, and one on the right. I entered the door directly in front of me first. Must have been a spare bedroom at one point. Now, however, it was a macabre storage room for bones, cartilage, and other hard bits. I backed out of the room and vomited in the hallway. I could no longer fight the odor, the sights, or my hangover at this time. After copious amounts of vomiting, I decided to try the left-hand side door. I slowly opened the door and peeked in. This room, it must have been the killer's organ room, because I discovered several pairs of lungs, all different sizes. There were 4 brains that I saw before I backed out and closed that door as well. Cue the second round of seemingly endless vomit escaping my throat at Mach 3. The door to the right, the door that chose the title of the story, nearly 40 years later. I slowly opened the door, weapon drawn, more for my own comfort than any protection. As the door opened, I got a glimpse into Hell's true kitchen. Human bodies, minus the skin and bones, were stapled to the walls, the floor, and the ceiling fan. I counted 7 bodies before I had to leave. I was sitting on the front stoop, giving control of my stomach to the hellish hangover, when my backup in the county coroner arrived. I couldn't speak. I just raised a shaky finger and pointed at the house. I remember feeling really lightheaded, then hearing the detective, a 20-year cop, scream like a girl. I passed out. I awoke some hours later, laying in bed in the county doctor's office. I sat up and made my way to the front, where I found the detective, the coroner, the mayor, and several other local officials. As I walked into the lobby, the coroner, who was also the town doctor, I told you it was a small rural town, turned to me and asked how I felt. Well, Doc, I really don't know, to be honest, I answered, not wanting to broadcast my terrible hangover. Ah, son, you'll be right as rain once you get home and take a few drinks. Or wait around and you can sample my collection, he whispered in a joking manner. I nervously laughed and nodded, having no intention of hanging around longer than I needed to. I walked around and mingled for a moment, before I went back to the coroner and asked what he thought of the house. Well, son, I'll tell you, I ain't never seen nothing like it. Counted 11 different corpses. No obvious cause of death to any of them. In that downstairs room. That place was coated, and my best guess was a mixture of pureed skin, fat, and bodily fluids. I fought back another surge of bile, before seeking my sergeant out of the crowd, and asking to leave early for the day. Of course, after what happened, he agreed, under the condition that I had my report to him by 9 in the morning, and on his desk. That night, I had the first dream. I was stumbling through an unfamiliar house. It was dark, wet, and damp. Every surface of the house was coated in a viscous fluid. I stumbled through the cramped hallway and finally found a light switch. I flipped on the light and I screamed. The entire house was made of meat. I could see veins and arteries pumping a dark brown fluid through the walls. Looking up, I see where the light is spilling forth from. a chandelier made of human skulls. I try to run from the house, but there's no door. I try to run at the walls to crash through, and each time I hit the wall with a sickening splorch, and I bounce back. Every time. I run to the opposite side of the house, trying to find a door. Instead, I can find what only can be described as King Kong's sphincter, grown into the wall. Part of my brain tries to tell me that I have to crawl through the giant pulsating asshole to escape this place. The other part of me thinks it's a trap. I frantically look around for something to stab the walls with, when I see a bone growing out of the wall. With a lot of effort and an unforgettable sound, the bone wrestles free. I hold it like a spear and run at the wall, stabbing the meat house. I hear and feel an incredibly deep rumble, and I'm thrown backwards as the walls leap forward, spitting the bone back onto the floor with a little dribble of brown blood. The walls seal the puncture wound. Desperate to escape, I stab the giant sphincter with the same bone that I tore from the wall. With another deep rumble, I'm slammed back. Not against the wall, but back into the room with the skull lights. That's when I wake up screaming hard enough to taste blood. The next morning, after turning my report in, the sergeant drags me into his office. He tells me the following. Look, we have a problem. If we tell the public what happened here, or hell, even what we found, the locals would panic. We would have drunk rednecks running around all vigilante. We have to cover this up. The house has been condemned. The coroner managed to come up with a good enough cover for the barrels of nasty ass shit that we took out of there. And the smell. Apparently the owners died in their sleep, and their pets died shortly after because of a gas leak. And as soon as the investigation's done, we'll burn it all to the ground. Officially, it's going to be an accidental death for both of the residents. The doc's trying to use dental records to identify the others, but he's not optimistic. Just remember the cover, and don't talk to anybody except me, Detective Lawson, or the doc. And that's what the paper said the following day. Officially, it was an accidental death, caused by an unchecked gas leak into the kitchen. Unofficially, we discovered a total of 13 bodies. None of them showed a cause of death. There was no foreign chemicals in the blood or body parts. Using every tool available to us, we were unable to identify any of the bodies. The homeowners were put to rest in a sealed coffin. We had access to the database of the feds, for an unrelated matter, and we still couldn't find the identity of either of the bodies. Any of the bodies. That's that. We never figured out what happened there, and it never happened again. I still have that nightmare, or a twisted version of it at least twice a month. There's more to come, guys. Just bear with me. Ever since childhood, I've had an interest in M.C. Escher and his works of amazing art. The way he made two-dimensional shapes and drawings blend into a three-dimensional appearance. It always fascinated the ever-loving fuck out of me. I couldn't help but smile when looking at any of his work, or most related to it. So, in 1981, when flyers depicting impossible shapes and figures started to litter our streets, I noticed. These flyers were printed out on colored paper, using the common dot matrix printers of the era. There was never a name or number, no excuse for the flyers. They depicted impossible shapes and figures that threatened to jump from the page directly into your eyes. They started out innocent enough at first. A few impossible triangle shapes, maybe some stairs that twist into nothing. You know, shit like that. After a couple of days, things started to get darker. The flyers were a mixture of Escher and Poe, as in Edgar Allan Poe. Instead of staircases and triangles, it was now headstones and open graves. Everything had eyes. The eyes seemed to move and blink if you moved the paper just right. People in town were starting to talk and worry, and talk some more. Things got a little comical at times, with theories ranging from deranged serial killer to ads for an upcoming restaurant. Of course, nobody actually knew what they were. See, small towns across the country have one thing in common: gossip. Not every citizen had seen the flyers yet, as some areas were just more remote. In fact, it looked like someone would just dump a load of flyers and let the wind deliver them. It was about 5 days in. That's when the flyers got even more disturbing, even hostile. To look at these images for long seemed to drive folks temporarily crazy as balls. To this day, I could even picture those fucking flyers. At first, there's nothing really there, just shapes and lines and dots. Then, like the much later magic eye things, if you gazed at the images just right, you could start to see the hidden pictures. Up to this point, all of the flyers released around one time would be printed on the same color paper, and they had the same exact design. This time, things were vastly different. Blue sheets depicted some sort of animal feasting on a flayed open corpse. Yellow sheets revealed some type of thing erupting from a man's back. Green sheets, those were the ones that got me. They depicted children eating from a dead woman's body. The red sheets, they showed some kind of thing that appeared to be Satan. Half man, half goat with twisted horns and a long spade-tipped tail with a forked tongue. This round of flyers triggered numerous calls flooding into 911 dispatch center, which was located in the basement of the courthouse. At least 200 people called in, some even going as far as to walk 3 miles to a payphone just to call in and report those vile flyers. That is what spurred my boss into making me take point on the investigation. This would be my first trip to the rodeo of detectivehood. It was both a big honor and a giant fuck you to me. Because if I could actually solve this, or at least peg the sick bastard distributing the flyers, it would cement my career. However, if I failed, it would kill it. I started my investigation by looking for patterns and where the flyers showed up. I noticed that the flyers would be distributed early mornings before sunup, on the days with strong early morning winds. That told me that the perp was intelligent, and had a way to accurately predict the high winds. It also showed the locations of the drop points, a peak above town, a ridge behind town, or even the small hills in people's farms. Anywhere with a higher elevation than the town square. That explained why some folks hadn't even seen a flyer. They were in the valleys, to the other side. I decided to hop in the car and go to the nearest drop point. I didn't use lights or sirens because I didn't think the course of investigation was an emergency. When I finally arrived at the top of Reynolds Point, I was greeted with an awful sight indeed. There's what appeared to be a crude altar constructed of rocks, twigs, tanned skin from deers and squirrels. Upon a small flat rock in the middle of the altar was the corpse of a mountain cat, a small breed of mountain lion. It had been killed and dissected with haste, as if somebody hurriedly looked through the insides of the poor thing. The intestines were coiled beside its head. Its stomach had been flipped inside out. It was now holding the poor thing's penis and testicles. In the place of its missing eyes, 2 chunks of amber, holding small lizard-looking things inside. I called out for the evidence collection team to clean the mess up, and I drove to the next suspected drop point. I drove to Madlands Ridge with the lights on, and my foot on the throat of the interceptor. I used to love the sound those things made. When the 4 barrels opened up, the engine could really stretch its legs. I was driving fast. Too fast, honestly. When I approached the Ridge access road, I almost didn't make the turn. But stupidity was strong with me that day. I flew up the road using the siren now, and as I tried to slow down and pull off the road at the hiking trail, a gigantic black dog, bigger than any dog I had ever seen, charged at me from the forest, directly toward my car. I slammed on the brakes, attempting to not murder somebody's pet, but I couldn't slow down the massive 4-door cruiser in time. I watched as the creature's face distorted into something unimaginable, just as the front bumper rammed into its body. There was no dent, no thud, no blood. It wasn't really there. I stopped the boat of the car in the middle of the road and just sat there looking around. Lights and sirens still continued to run overhead. I was shaken from my stupor when the radio cracked to life. The evidence team had found the altar. They were not happy, but they had no choice but to collect everything. I finally managed to steer the car over to the wide spot so I could park and hike my fat ass up the little hill to the flat-lined ridge. As I climbed the hill, I noticed dark spots in the soil and splotches of reddish and black liquid that had fallen on the leaves. That nervous feeling in my stomach started to increase to an almost intolerable level. I could feel something in my bones. I knew I would find something terrible on that hill. I expected another altar, complete with mutilated animal corpses. I was right, but so wrong. As I neared the top of the hill, I could see the circular field stone surrounding a makeshift altar. Upon the altar, there was a body, all right, but not a fucking woodland animal like I expected. It was the body of a human, a small child, naked and mutilated. The insides were torn out and strewn about the altar. The poor kid's head wasn't even there. Neither were her fingers or the soles of her feet. The bastard took everything we could use to identify the kid. Now, I was pissed. I called dispatch and had Irene turn out a coroner, and let the evidence crew know they had more work up here too. Later that day, I would find 3 more altars, each one with a different body. A deer, sheep, coyote, then a poor mountain cat, and the child. Each location was documented, cleaned, removed, and reconstructed in the basement of the jail. That was where we did our recreations. It took us a while to figure out the next bit. Actually, too long. It was 3 days later when I finally decided to put up thumbtacks in the county map to designate each altar. That's when it became apparent. The fucking altars were arranged in a pentagram. That fact cemented the idea of Satanism into our minds. Hell, if it had not been for the child's body, we would have collectively shrugged off the entire thing as some prank by some sick-ass fucking teenager. We would have never had thought that it would have turned out to be this. During the next week, we talked to more than 100 people, the biggest majority of which were clueless as to what we asked. There were a few we managed to find out were into drugs, but no Satan worship. That is, until we discovered a woman by the name of Gina Paisley. She was a self-proclaimed white witch turned dark magic. Magic being spelled with a K, of course. Gina was nervous when we confronted her with the pictures of the animals. I saved the child's body for last, to help me gauge her involvement criminally. When I showed her the picture of the folder, and I placed it down on the table in front of her, she went nuts. She jumped out of her chair that she was seated in. She started to pull handfuls of hair from her head, as she screamed, "No, not like that. You called wrong. He was wrong. We're all gonna die if he isn't stopped." My sergeant and I exchanged worried glances, as a deputy restrained her. We cuffed her to the table. When she finally calmed herself down a bit, we continued to question her. During the questioning, which lasted 11 hours due to her mental breakdowns, we discovered that her and her son had been trying to summon a demon to do their, and I quote, "dirty work we can't do without going to prison," end quote. It took us an additional hour and a half to find the son. We kicked in the door of his trailer. He was standing there behind the little Lawson girl. Poor little Amy was tied to a chair with a gag in her mouth, a blindfold on her head, and that was all she was wearing. I shot before I could even think. I saw the knife in his hand, and I saw the hand moving towards the girl. I turned his fucking head into a jack-ass-o'-lantern. We searched the home after releasing the terrified child. I gave her my jacket and button-up shirt to wear until the ambulance arrived. We found a dozen books of summoning rituals, all in Latin. We had to send the books to the University of Kentucky just to be translated. We found 2 more children tied up in the spare bedroom, both drugged and asleep. The guy had taken them from a few towns over, to avoid raising suspicion. We found his journal, and in it, he wrote how he wanted to summon a demon, his dark lord, and how he wanted to give himself wholly to the beast. Most of the spiral-bound book was written many fantasies, in which the devil would sexually assault the writer, sometimes with force, but most often by the guy's own choice. He talked about how the world was not good enough to house him and his mother, who he had admitted to being in a sexual relationship with, having a baby with her as well. He then goes on to talk about how the baby was sacrificed to Satan on his 666th day of life. That was what started his quest to raise Satan. Gina was charged with complicity to kidnapping, complicity to murder, cruelty to animals, desecration of a corpse, tampering with physical evidence, and even with the incest. She was sentenced to 98 years and 1 day in jail by the Honorable Judge T. Lawson. We never found the computer that printed the papers. Hell, neither one of the Paisleys even owned a printer or a computer. We did, however, receive an anonymous letter, claiming to be responsible for the flyers, saying they knew those two were up to some sick shit, and they knew if the pictures got bad enough, eventually the police were going to investigate. We never saw another Twisted Escher wannabe. Sorry this was a longer one, folks, but it took me a bit to finish it. The case still brings a tear, and whenever I remember it, I mourn not only for the child, but for the parents of that child, being out there, knowing your child is gone, but not why or even if she's still alive. If they read this, please forgive me. I tried to get an ID, even a few years ago. I went so far as to pay for a DNA testing. However, the blood was just too degraded. Same with the marrow. I tried to bring your family closure, I really did. I'm sorry, guys. I'm spent. Good night. We'll get another story soon. Hello, internet friends, family, and horror fiends. 'Tis I, but the old man, back with yet another tale of my rural law enforcement officer. In this one, I was still a rookie, and such, I caught the shit cases. The calls were usually by crazies or senile old folks that imagined an intruder with multiple heads. Those calls were the ones that the more seasoned officers had grown tired of. The first dozen or two calls I rolled were in fact false. They were the result of old age, mental illness, and wild imaginations. Paranoid youngsters that hear a thump when they're home alone. All were perfectly understandable and easily diffused. Then, well, there was this case. Like I said, I was still a rookie, wet behind the ears, so to say. It was early spring of '68, maybe April or May, not entirely sure on that. I do know that it was unusually warm for that time of year. I had been assigned the night shift, 12 to 12, simply because my boss, well, he was a dick. And I made a pass at his daughter. Really fucked him up when I later invited him to our wedding. Anyway, I was chugging truck stop coffee and dumping handfuls of no-dose pills just to be awake for my shift. The parking lot was on the side of a main stretch of interstate leading towards our little hamlet. Is that the right word? Nah. I was just swallowing a new handful of caffeine pills with the slug of that nuclear hell-hot coffee from the truck stop near my current stopping place, when the radio decided to kick on. Nearly choked on my pills and spit out the coffee onto the steering wheel as I tried to answer the call.
Car 78, what's your 20? Over. Dispatch, this is Car 78. I'm at the local truck stop, parked outside waiting for violations. Over. Car 78, we need you to roll code 3 to address. For a possible domestic disturbance with malice and intent, subject is possibly armed with a handgun. Victim is one Miss Tina Edmonton, 24 years old, brown hair, blue eyes. Offender is believed to be the husband, one George Edmonton. Roll and repeat. Over. Roger that.
I hit the lights and sirens and made the 10-minute trip a little bit quicker. About 200 yards from the driveway, I killed the sirens, but I left the lights on to semi-announce my presence. I pulled into the driveway. I immediately noticed that both of the vehicles were in the yard, rather than the driveway. As I parked my cruiser, I started to notice some strange things right away. I felt like something was watching me, something big. Whatever it was not friendly. I also had every one of the hairs on my arm standing straight up, along with the little hairs on the back of my neck. I could feel something else too. Something I can only describe as buzzing or vibrating deep inside my body. Like how your hands feel after a couple hours of weed whacking. But it was over my entire body. For a moment it was actually kind of a pleasant feeling. But then it started to intensify, until I could feel an electric current traveling across every inch of my skin. It eventually faded into a dull feeling, like being covered by walking flies. Ugh. I managed to push all of this down to a sustainable level. I even managed to convince myself along the way that it was due to a caffeine overdose. I laid my hand on the handle of my service weapon, as my thumb undid the leather strap securing the piece into my holster. Hand on firearm, I approached the open door. Things were silent. Not supernatural silent, but quiet enough to where I could hear my own heartbeat. As I approached the door, I called out and identified myself. Hello, County Sheriff's Department. I need to speak with you. Hello. If you do not respond, I will enter the premises and search for you. I ascended the broken and crumbling cement steps to the front door. Standing in the open doorway, it was obvious that a bad fight had happened. Furniture was strewn about, tables tipped over, a couch was overturned on its side, split by some type of sharp blade. The carpet was even cut up and rolled back in a couple of spots. Dishes were shattered and laying around everywhere. The place was really truly in shambles. However, there were no bloodstains or signs of any other injuries. Straining to hear, hoping to hear, signs of life from the wife or even movement of the husband. Again, I announced myself. Hello, police, I need you to come out right now. I made my way through the home, careful not to step on any of the evidence. And I found the guest bedroom first. It looked a lot like the living room. Mattress sliced open, drawers pulled out, contents scattered around. In my rookie brain, it was obvious someone had been looking for something that they really wanted. As I made my way to the master bedroom, I started to hear something. An intermittent plop noise every few seconds. Again, I announced myself. County Sheriff's Department, I need you to step out right now, or I'm coming in. You will go to jail today. Come out now, and maybe we can talk this whole thing out. I lied. I was already pissed, and somebody was already going to jail that day. As I turned the knob to the bedroom, I could have swore I heard something shuffling in the room. I quietly and slowly turned the knob before kicking the door open, weapon drawn. I entered the room, and the source of the plopping noise was Mr. Edmonton on the ceiling. His body was completely destroyed. Flesh was hanging off in strips, allowing blood to drain and drip into pools under the body. His head was oddly off, and it took me far longer than I care to admit to discover that it was turned around backwards. His chest was facing the floor, and his face was on the ceiling. I couldn't see what was affixing the body to the ceiling, and I didn't have a lot of time to absorb my surroundings. As I was looking at the body of the deceased, I heard a soft shuffling sound. This time, I was able to determine the location of the source of the sound. It was coming from the shut closet doors. Again, I announced myself. Police, come out now with your hands up, and in plain sight, come out on your own. Don't make this more difficult than it has to be. I stated it. I listened closely. I could distinctly hear a small shuffle, and then what sounded like 3 or 4 deadbolts clicking into place at the same time. I quickly rushed the door, tearing the closet open, my weapon raised. I was met with an empty closet. Large walk-in type closet, but still a fucking empty closet. Now, I know I heard something moving inside the closet, but the clothing was hanging there, stationary. Everyone knows when you touch something hanging in a closet, it sways for a little while. I pushed the clothing aside, and I inspected the back wall. It was a solid white wall, but it was cold to the touch. Much colder than it was that day. I was running my hand down the wall when a loud crash occurred from the direction of the kitchen. I turned to rush that way, and as I did, I felt a cold breeze blow over me. It was like I was standing in front of an industrial freezer blowing sub-zero air. I shivered a bit and stepped out of the closet. I crossed the threshold from closet to bedroom, and I was overcome with a feeling of intense vertigo. The world was swirling around me, twisting and turning. For a moment, I thought I saw a young woman, what would have matched the description of the wife, walking through the wall and outside of the house. Again, I shrugged this all off as an overdose of shitty coffee and stay-awake pills. I walked from the bedroom down the short hall to the kitchen. In the kitchen, which was absolutely a mess when I arrived, stood a young girl, maybe 10 or 11. The kitchen was clean, and the living room was perfect. As I turned around to attempt to gather my head, I saw the yard. There were no vehicles out there other than mine. I turned back to address the child. Hey, sweetie, where's your... She was gone. I closed my eyes to calm myself. I was absolutely shitting peach pits at this point. And when I opened them just a couple of seconds later, I was standing in the middle of a burnt-out house. There was nothing there. And honestly, I was afraid I'd fall through the floor. I made my way to the cruiser, the whole time having a fit of every fucking emotion imaginable. I slumped into the driver's seat and I looked at the burnt husk of a home. From the looks, it had been burnt for quite a while. In fact, there was a small tree growing through the roof near the master bedroom closet. Now, I was pissed off. I keyed my radio only to find it non-functional. I tried my portable. It wouldn't work either. I took a few deep breaths, finished my coffee, and left it on the console. I backed out of the driveway and turned to leave. My radio crackled to life the point I hit the road.
Car 78, what's your 20? Over.
Dispatch, this is 78. I'm where you sent me a while ago. I'm just leaving. Over.
Car 78, I haven't spoken to you all night. I've been trying to contact you for almost 2 hours now. I was about to send patrol out looking. Over.
Dispatch, you called me out to the Edmonton place for domestic violence. When I got there,
It was burned down. Yeah, no shit. 78, it burned back in 59. Miss Edmonton had been getting beaten and, well... Come to the station, we could talk about it. I was wondering when you would get the call. Over.
I made my way back to the station and tried to settle my nerves. Before I got to town, I smelled a strong smell of something burning. I looked out the side windows and I didn't see anything. And when I glanced into the rear view, I screamed and slammed on the brakes, sliding all over the road. When I completely came to a stop, I leapt from the car and peered into the back window. It was an empty seat. But I knew for a fact there was a burnt corpse in my back seat. I made my way back to the station where I would have a long chat with Irene. The short of it is, Mr. E had been beating the ever-living shit out of his wife multiple times. She had taken it and never complained once. That is, until the beating caused her to have a miscarriage. When she healed from that one, she slipped her hubby a few strong sleeping pills. And while he was out, she gutted him. She then set the house on fire with the body inside, before she just vanished into thin air. Nobody could explain how the tiny woman managed to drive 10 nails into her husband's dead body while it was against the ceiling. When the fire was finally put out, they found him charred and nailed to the ceiling. They never found the wife, and nobody was really looking to arrest her for the murder of that bastard. Few people did try to find her, but they did so because they were worried about her. Each one of them would end the effort within 3 or 4 days. They simply told people she must not want to be found. The smell of a burning corpse lingered in my cruiser for weeks, and I was the only one who could smell it. Apparently, this is what happened. Every rookie would get that call once. Every one of them would be tormented by that smell. Each had a slightly different experience in the house, but enough alike to match up. Anytime I burned my dinner, I remember that moment in the car. God help me, that fucking smell. It's unforgettable. Hey guys, I want to start this out by apologizing because I absconded kind of for a couple of weeks with the holidays all falling on Thursdays and Fridays, and family being around. I didn't have much time to do recording, so I appreciate your patience. Let's get right into the story. Tales from a Rural Police Officer, Part 5. The Ouija Fence. Thank you all for the love, guys. I have to say, the outpourings of positive words have helped me a lot. The thoughts of how my hellish experiences have brought joy to others, even for just a few moments a day, well, that's an amazing feeling. Lately, I've not had much to be happy about. When I decided to share my stories, I had no idea they would be this popular. I just thought it would be good for my mental health to get these out there. I mean, I guess I was right, but still, wow. Anyway, for today's tale from a rural police officer, I shall recount a case I had, until very recently, completely forgotten about. I had blocked out these memories, and I was happy never to think of them. That is, until a commenter mentioned a trip to a cemetery. I remembered the time I was forced to clean up some teenagers out of a cast iron fence that surrounded a local cemetery. So, without delay, let us begin. It was my very, very first case as a solo operating patrol officer. The year was 1966, it was April 24th, and I just finished my training, as well as the 3 months of riding with the senior officer. I was young, dumb, and entirely too eager to be a solo policeman. It had always been a dream of mine to be a cop, and I felt like I achieved my lifelong dream. I had just been given my first cruiser, and I was actually detailing it in the driveway of my rental when the radio crackled to life, alerting me to my first call. My first solo call.
Car 78, come in. Over.
Dispatch, this is Car 78. Over.
Car 78, we've received several calls about noises and commotion at the premise of the cemetery. I need you to roll out and investigate. Ride and report. Oh, and congratulations on making the force. Over.
I anxiously backed my boat of a cruiser out of my driveway, and I started the 20-mile drive to the cemetery. The roads were pretty empty for a Saturday morning, and the trip didn't take long. When I got within sight of the cemetery, I stopped and listened to the sound. I could hear some people talking and laughing, as well as the sound of rocks rubbing together. Big rocks. That deep, rumbly sound, with accents of bass. And some sounds I can only think of as what the fuck sounds. I proceeded to drive up the gravel driveway to the gates that led to the graves. I exited my car and I started to look around. I noticed that somebody had brought a fold-away card table into the cemetery, and that the table had been set up in front of a very large old headstone. I walked a little bit closer to inspect. I began to notice things as I approached, like the candles melted onto the table, and the Ouija board that was also on the table. I called out, hoping to garner the attention of whoever was there. "Hello, County Sheriffs, I need to talk to you. Can you please step out?" I was greeted with silence. I thought maybe I heard a small chuckle from somewhere in the cemetery, but I wasn't sure. The sound of rocks rubbing together has intensified. I walked further into the cemetery. Again, I announced myself as I was trained to do. As I tried to communicate with whoever was up there, I started to get that feeling of, like, impending doom. You know the feeling, right? That feeling that something bad, really bad, is getting ready to happen. There's nothing you could do to abate the feeling either. This wasn't good. I knew things were about to go shit show sideways, but there was not a fucking thing I could do about it. I drew my service weapon and swept the nearby area for activity. I wasn't able to see anybody, but I did get a feeling that I was being watched. I decided to walk toward the back of the graveyard, where the oldest graves were. I stopped under a large willow tree in the shade. I scanned my surroundings. I was now starting to have cold sweats and a feeling of intense vertigo. I stumbled into the sunlight again, and I walked to the south corner of the place. Oh my god. What the actual fuck? There was something in, on, under, and through the cast iron fence in the back corner. I didn't immediately recognize what I was seeing, so I had to approach and inspect the situation. I wish I hadn't. I still think about the whole scenario, and it opened me up to the rest of the wild and crazy shit that happened to me while I was an officer. I was about 3 feet from the fence when the smell got me. The smell of someone's insides being, well, outside. It was an awful, awful scent, and one that you will never forget. I had been with the senior officer when we found a body that had been through a hay baler, and I knew the scent, so I walked closer, careful not to step on any, evidence. That's when I realized what I was seeing. Someone, or multiple someones, had been flipped inside out and slammed against the cast iron fence. Their clothing was in tatters, mixed in with bits of bone and tangled meat that was, well, at one point, a human body. Bits of bone and teeth sprinkled the mess like stars in the night sky. I didn't see a single piece of bone bigger than about an inch long or an inch wide. Something had nearly pulverized these people or person. I decided that since I hadn't received my portable radio yet, I would walk the perimeter and search for survivors or clues. As I made my way to the car to radio back to dispatch, on my short journey, I discovered 3 more scenes of gore, one in each cardinal direction from the center of the cemetery. Each as disturbing as disgusting as the first. I finally made my way to the car and I called out for the coroner, but I was told, "Sorry, 76, the coroner won't come out to do graveyard retrievals. He will show up, but he will not cross the cemetery lines. He says he sees enough death without visiting its home. so you'll have to collect the bodies. Something like that. Great, send some barrels. There's not much left. Also, evidence bags. Dispatch agreed, and all was silent again. I remembered the table and the board, so that's where I went. I noticed that there was a sheet of paper there with some words written on it. From memory, I can only remember some of them, but they should be enough to fill in the gaps and answer some of your questions. Food, death, hate, race, filth, die, 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 not, welcome, danger, leave, peace, not, here, death awaits. I was of the mind that people playing with the board had written the words that they got from the board. I know that a lot of people will refuse to believe that these things work, but they do. And they're dangerous, especially if they're not used right. Even an idiot knows that using one in a graveyard is a stupid idea. See, Ouija boards aren't inherently good or evil. They have no filter that selects out just good or neutral spirits. They communicate with any and all spirits around. As in, they talk to everything. Sometimes, all an evil entity needs to cross over to the world is, well, a little attention. Cemeteries are powerful places. Add kids and a Ouija board, and you have a recipe for death and disaster. The coroner arrived shortly after I radioed in, and he began to tell me a little bit about the history of the cemetery. The oldest grave here doesn't even have a stone. It's an unmarked grave, containing an evil and nasty man-child. Theodore Dubois. He was a nasty plantation owner back in the county, before it was even a county, when the area was still unclaimed. It had home to all types of nasty people, outlaws, murderers, and people suspected of witchcraft. Teddy here, well, he was a little bit of all three. He had been chased out of the Northern Territories and settled here after he discovered the unique properties of the land around here. In the early 1800s, he started to sell his services out as a land magician. He claimed to have a direct connection to black magic, and he sold his spells and curses to other people just as evil as himself. In the year 1824, Teddy here sold a curse to a man. The man had his eyes on a holy man's daughter, but the young lady wanted nothing to do with him. Theodore sold the man a hex or whatever, and eventually, shit got wild. The preacher died in his sleep. The money he saved up was never found. The livestock died and the well dried up. The poor girl had nothing left. Before she went with a man like that, she took her own life. After her suicide, the man who bought the curse got angry, blamed old Theo here for the death of his crush, came after him one night during a storm. He wound up getting himself killed, but enough people were talking now. A lynch mob formed, and they strung up the witch man from a willow tree. The coroner pointed at the willow tree in the cemetery. He continued. This used to be his yard. The flat spot there, that was his plantation. The town folks left the body in the tree for about a week before digging a hole and cutting the rope, just letting him drop into his new home. They decided not to honor the man with a memory, and the only place his name is listed is in the courthouse records, as a way of keeping people from digging him up while burying someone else. People have claimed that he haunts the cemetery here, and since the cast iron fence closes the place off, he can't get out without a body. Unfortunately for him, he can't take a body from an unwilling host. So, this is what happens. He tries to take one by force, and the body is destroyed. So, you're telling me a ghost did this? I asked. No, I'm telling you a very dark and very evil entity did this. This isn't the first time, and it probably won't be the last. As long as kids keep coming here to play with those damn spirit boards, they'll keep dying. I managed to clean the remainder of the scene while the coroner droned on and on about the dark practices that have happened here, and how the area is a hotbed for otherworldly beings and happenings. He then told me that if I were lucky, they would leave me alone, but he believed this was an omen. So that's how I came to understand just how big of a deal it was to play with a talking board in a graveyard. I cleaned those kids out of the fence, and we couldn't identify them from what was left. We had to wait for their parents to report him missing. When they did report him missing, the entire police force was disturbed to learn that it had been only two teenagers, a boy of 17 and a young woman of 19. They had been going around playing with this Ouija board in all the local spooky spots, including cemeteries. That thing, or something, tore those two kids into 4 messes. Please, folks, don't use a Ouija board anywhere, let alone a cemetery. Today's tale was gonna be about the finger plants that were cursed within a tobacco crop. They never grew beyond fingers, so it's a little bit different than what transpired at that remote gas station, but similar enough that I was worried about posting it because people may get offended or think I'm trying to copy a popular gas station tale, which I'm not. So, should I post the finger plant story, or should I just find another tale to tell? Let me know what you think. I remembered something yesterday. While I was watering my garden, I rushed inside and watered the center of the story. I searched the internet all over for something similar to what we encountered. After about an hour of useless Google searches, I finally found something pretty similar, but at the same time pretty different. What am I talking about? What did I find similar to it? Well, the thing is, I remembered the finger crops, and I searched for over an hour before finding a no-sleep guide that reported entire hand plants that eventually grew into replica people. While that was disturbing as all hell, I still felt it worth sharing our experience. So, here it goes. Back in the 70s, 80s, and even up to the early 2000s, tobacco was the major cash crop in our area. The majority of local families depended on the money earned from the tobacco sales in the fall, just to survive the winter, as well as to provide Christmas for their kids. It was a way of life. All spring long, the families would work to set up float beds of styrofoam plates that held 24 seedlings of tobacco plants. It would float on top water with added nutrients inside to build up the platform. While the seeds were taking off, the winter's cover crop of clover would be plowed into the ground to add nutrients to the soil. The field had to be rough enough to plow in early spring. That's when the seedlings were to develop their root system. The fields would be plowed again, then descend into the furrows of rows. The plants would then be set by hand, usually. Later on, people could afford setter attachments to the tractors that would seat 2 people. Those 2 people would then pluck plants from the float trays and set them in a wheel, and the machine would drop them into the ground a set distance apart. The plants would be left to grow until they developed flower tops. The tops would then be cut or snapped off by hand to make the plant kinda bush out. A couple of months later, farmers would drop sticks every other row. Then, workers would cut to the next plants down, spearing them through the stalk onto the stick. The cutters would swing a very sharp, specialized hatchet called a tobacco knife. Each worker would cut 2 rows at a time for a few cents a stick. Each stick would hold 6 to 8 stalks of tobacco. The sticks were then left in the field for a couple of weeks before being collected, and then they were hung from the rafters of the barn to cure. In late fall, workers would climb into the barn, chopping the sticks down. Then people would strip the leaves off the stalks and press the leaves into bales. Each plant had multiple types of leaves. Each type was placed into its own bale. The bales would then be transported to auction, where tobacco companies would bid on the lot. I described the process so you could see just how hard these families work for just a little bit of cash. Some years the price would be 50 cents a pound. Some other years it would be over $1 per pound. That's why the different bales of hay for the different leaves. The better leaves brought better money, but the companies wanted the other leaves too, what we would just call trash, just for a much, much lower price. The families worked hard, lived hard, and just barely managed to make ends meet. Back then, a majority of local families lived under the national poverty line. Hard times all around. Classic, money's tight and times are hard, but here's your fucking Christmas card type situations. It had to be the middle of spring of '88 when this happened. I remember that because I had recently got married, just a few months before this. I was actually on my honeymoon, which we had to wait to take for some financial reasons. But when the first calls came in, even the mayor and the county attorney had their panties wadded around their dangly bits. I was called in at 3 in the morning after getting home that same morning. I was ordered to do whatever I had to, but I had to get my happy ass to the apartment post-haste. They even hung up on me, too. When I dragged my tired ass to the office, I was slightly shaken to see the entire force on duty. The mayor, the chief of police, and the county attorney. all rather impatiently waiting on my arrival. I was greeted by not happy friends, but by an entire building of scared-ass cops and county officials. "Well, it's about fucking time. Welcome home, Sheriff. Now sit your ass down so we can get you caught up on this situation," the county attorney barked, before turning on a heel and leaving the room. "Right, 3 days ago we received the first call. The Larson's farm hand called 911, ranting and raving about fingers in the tobacco trays. Dispatch sent out an ambulance and a patrol unit to respond, thinking the kid had sliced off a finger at work. When they arrived on the scene, the farmhand, Mr. Timothy Gray, was sitting on a tractor tire drinking from a glass bottle of whiskey. I feel the need to mention this was approximately 7:30 a.m. at this point. The EMS tech rushed to his position to examine a possible injury. I will now read Mr. Gray's response verbatim. Not me, you dumbass. Look in the fucking beds. Fuck it, I quit. Tell the Larsons to keep the money I've worked off this week. He then drank the bottle, staggered to his camper on the property. A deputy told him to stay put, but he was drunk, and we would arrest him if we even tried to start his truck. It was at this point that the other deputies decided to investigate. Collins, tell the sheriff what you found, ordered the mayor. Collins stood up to talk. The mayor exited the room, but as he was leaving, he stopped at my desk. He whispered, "Come see me immediately after you're briefed. Don't tell anyone, though." As I approached the float beds, I noted something strange. A smell, like a wood smoke mixed with a strong hint of cat piss. Not just the ammonia used in the beds, this was something else. I raised a plastic covering to examine the trays and, well, I just about shat myself, sir. We were a relaxed agency back then. I couldn't believe my eyes. Fingers, dozens of them, wriggling around, like hands used under the trays, poking through. Except when I pulled out the tray, there was no hand, just fingers. First knuckle where it would attach to the root of the hand, growing from the soil. I plucked one out of the dirt and, well, it was fucking warm. It still had red roots and everything, just flowing around this white bulb type of thing. That's where the knuckle was. The hands continued to wriggle for a while, but I could feel it get colder. It started moving slower. I don't know why, but I put it back in the goddamn tray. Put the tray back in the water. A few seconds later, the fingers started to wiggle around again. And that's when he passed out. Thankfully, the EMS was already there, laughed Colin's partner Todd. As the bus monkeys, that's what we called them back in the day, they called us bubblegum machines, chucked on old Lightweight there, I decided to take a look at the float beds. I can honestly say that was the single most disturbing thing I had ever seen in my life, and I've cleaned up cannibal murder scenes before. Those fucking things were growing from the trays, just wriggling around, reaching for anything that moved. He finished looking just a little bit more than a bit sickened. I sent samples of the roots of an entire finger to a college, and they still haven't gotten back to me. I can't get the professor on the phone. From what I could see and everything I know, they're just normal fucking fingers, with roots of some kind. Our local coroner/doctor said, polishing his glasses. And now, to add to the damn situation, we have 3 more farms in the last 24 hours all reporting fingers on the tobacco trays, for a total of 11 farms affected, Terry, the rookie, said. I sat there trying to decide if this was all a fucking prank, or if it was even honestly happening. I received my definitive answer a couple of minutes later when the chief came in with a small clay pot. There were 3 fingers in the dirt just fucking wriggling around, and, well, like, looking at me. I swear that sounds like a lie, but these fingers could fucking see. I moved my hand above them and they followed. I waved at them and they mimicked my movement. I flipped them off and 2 of the fingers folded down, leaving one standing up, kinda dancing in a circular motion. I stood up and walked my tired ass to the mayor's office. When I walked to his door, he stood up and walked to the door too, locking it behind me. He proceeded to motion towards a chair and went behind his desk. I could tell you got to see the sample here. Well, I think we need this. The mayor reached down in his desk and poured us each a tumbler of scotch. We sipped our drinks and he continued. I think we gotta call in some of the alphabet squad to handle this, Sheriff. I just don't think we have the ability to do it alone. Then, what about the families that were counting on the tobacco money? What do we do with them? Half their crops are fingers and we just confiscated them all. But that does nothing to help them. Well, do we have any of the emergency AG funds left? I mean, somebody pays for the crops with mold damage, right? Okay, yeah, sure, the Department of AG would love to pay for a bunch of failed crops due to a finger infestation. I I don't even know who to call about this. These things came from somewhere, and we need to ship them somewhere too. We tried to destroy some, as an experiment in containment. They don't burn. The charred remains reanimate with just a single drop of moisture. Cutting them up forces them to sprout roots like eyes from a damn tater. The only thing that can configure is round them up and ship them off somewhere. I can look for other ways to help the families. I need you to go to the tax department and get a list of properties with tobacco bases. Then go check them out. I'll try to figure out what to do with these fucking things and find a way to supplement the families this winter. I finished my drink and left his office, going upstairs to the tax office. I had the list printed out, and I found about 56 other farms in the county that had bases. I split my troops up, each 7 going into a cruiser or county truck. We tackled the list as a giant 8-headed worm. I took the most distant farms to the east next to wet country. Coincidence? No. My plan was to go home and drink copious amounts of alcohol. The 8 farms on my list all turned out to be empty. I got a radio message from another trooper that stopped to render aid at a scene of an MVA. I finished out his list for him. The last of the farms on his list, I hit the mother lode. Every plant was a bed of wagging fingers. I called the mayor, who sent out 4 county pickup trucks with plastic beds so they can hold water. We loaded every single one of the finger plants into the truck. The family was devastated. They were counting on that money for living, not for comfort, food, rent, and shit like that. I was tearing up. I watched Jeb Tolson, a 6'8", 300-pound farmer, cry. He was devastated. He didn't know how he was going to feed his family this winter. I gave him my card with my home phone number written on it, telling him to call me if I could do anything at all to help. On my drive back to the warehouse, I contacted our game warden through the radio. I told him that he needed to be a little more lax on some poaching this winter. I told him something had gone wrong with a major chunk of the populace's bases. He was supportive of the idea, but he did say anybody caught who didn't need the meat would go to jail, and the meat would go to charity, as usually for families that just need a little bit of extra help. When I arrived back at the warehouse with the evidence, just as a few of the other guys were getting back too, in total, after roundup, there were 36 farms hit by what was slyly dubbed, the finger bang. I would later meet a few guys when the mayor called in. I even called my brother. My brother is odd. He loves these carnivorous plants. He has dozens of Venus flytraps, pincher plants, and something that looks like a fucking meat flower. The meat flower is nasty. It smells like a corpse flower, but not too strong, just strong enough to attract prey. The damn thing snaps shut when stimulated. It's disgusting. I was hoping maybe he could help. He couldn't. But the weirdo did take several fingers to feed to his damn plants. I told you. He's pretty fucking odd. However, I did get a call from Dear Brother the next day. He tried to feed the fingers to the meat flower and pincher plant. Evidently, the meat flower snap closed, and the finger fucking went off. It managed to grow a fingernail, just enough to cut through the petals. The finger inside the meat flower struggled and fought. The others tried to crawl to its location, like they were trying to help. But the thing I found most odd about this phone call was my brother wasn't creeped out. He was just pissed off that he paid $3,000 for the meat flower. I told you, weird as fuck. We never did figure out where those things exactly came from. They never got any bigger. When one sprout dies, a new fingernail will be poking up through the dirt in 24 hours. I know they can live for years at a time. They don't really care about temperature, but they don't act as lively in the cold. The vast majority of the fingers were smuggled out west, somewhere in the PNW. Some were kept as souvenirs, and for science, of course. I'm sitting here watching mine wave at me right now. I kept a black one, a tan one, and 3 white ones. I originally have had 5 white fingers. When one dies, another one grows. Not always the same color or sex. Not always different. They don't all have fingerprints, but the ones that do never track to anybody, alive or dead. The DNA reads as human, but a human that would never survive birth. They don't flower. They never develop past the finger. They don't grow any bigger than a normal human finger. The strangest thing, to me anyway, is they don't grow like a human. They sprout a full-grown nail, and then a finger fully emerges after about 24 hours. I didn't find out where they came from. We never saw them appear again. We didn't call the feds. We did pull some cash together, and the guys got deer tags, and we hunted the fill. We distributed the meat and cash among the destroyed families by the finger bang. We got them gifts for the kids for Christmas, and we got them some school supplies and new outfits for the kids to start school. We couldn't replace the money lost, but we did help some. Sorry this one was a little bit long, but it had to be told. It had to be told so I could tell the next story. The one that kind of hinges on you knowing all of this one. I probably should have put the line at the top in the first few paragraphs before advertising and discussing tobacco growing. Hell, I don't really expect anyone to read this one. But I do expect folks to say I copied an idea from a very popular story. I don't have anything to prove that I did, except for a fist flipping me the bird in a flower pot. Well, farewell till next time. This tale follows on the tale of the finger plant fiasco. So, I was at home, trying to explain to my wonderful wife exactly why I had a flower pot of fingers on the patio. I was winning the debate on keeping them when my phone decided to ring. Yet again. I answered with a cocky attitude and a sarcastic remark, something along the lines of, "Am I the only fucking cop you know?" And I was met with a staunch ignorance and an attitude from the coroner.
Look, smartass, you're the fucking sheriff, so yeah. Basically, you're the only cop I fucking know. So shove that snarky attitude and get your fat ass back to the old Peter farm. Code 3 it if you want. It's bad.
I explained to my wife that I had to go. Being the daughter of a cop before marrying me, she had already been very clear on the perception of how our life together would be. She would often say, I was married to the job, but I had a mistress. I used to argue that point, but she had the proof. All of it. She'd been right. But that's not the story you want to hear, is it? I don't think so. You want to hear about the last of the finger plants, right? Well, maybe where they came from. Or maybe you just want to see pictures. Hell, I don't know. Maybe you want to be creeped out or even terrified. I want to answer your questions. And I want to describe my creepiest encounters. But first, this one. I arrived at the police station. When I actually made it to my desk, I was instantly approached by the coroner. Well, it took you fucking long enough, jackass. Come with me. I gotta show you something. I followed the large man down the hallway, under the elevator. I couldn't help but chuckle at the sight of the large man waddling down the hallway, like a duckling with a sprained foot. What made it even funnier was the bright yellow scrubs he always wore. On the elevator down to the garage, the coroner cracked a rather loud and wet fart, before flapping his bright yellow scrubs to disperse the acrid stench of ass. I was about to tell the nasty bastard exactly what I thought, when he started to spew hot air from the other end. So I was called to a natural death recovery this morning. Happened to find something that I thought you should see. I haven't shown or told anybody else what I'm about to show you. So I arrived at the scene to collect Mrs. Thompson, and when I get there, her hospice nurse is just pacing back and forth in front of the front door, damn near eating her fingers off. I tried to get her to show me inside, but she refused to enter the house. She gave me her card and fucking flew out of there. So I grabbed my stretcher, a bag, and glove up, and I walked in the door. I noticed there was a small line of flour in front of the door, like a barrier. But it's flour, not salt. So I don't know why it was there. I stepped over it and entered the home. When I stepped in, I noticed right away not the smell of death. No, not that easy. The smell of putrescine, infection. That could be explained away, except Mrs. Thompson didn't have any open sores, and she was only dead because of a brain tumor that had just been discovered a month prior. So I immediately went into search and destroy mode. He paused here, and we quickly exited the elevator that had become an execution chamber for two. I go into the home and I'm looking for the deceased, and I find this, he continued, and he pointed at the table in the corner of the dark, dingy morgue. On the table was a shape that I recognized somewhere in the primal area of my brain, but not quite on a conscious level. It's a fetus, Sheriff. It's not viable, no brain, but that's not the odd part. What's odd is this, he said as he flipped over the fetus to reveal its backside. Growing out of the back and the head were millions of hair-like roots. They were still caked in dirt and actively twitching in front of us. What the actual fuck? First the damn fingers, now this? What's wrong with this town? I asked out loud to nobody in particular. The coroner went on to tell me that Miss Thompson had been harvesting her own eggs. He told me that she went as far to remove an ovary and had made arrangements with something or someone to provide cooling chambers. Now I have to say that IVF was not very popular or effective back then, so having a way to store viable embryos was an amazing feat for a normal person. He continued by telling me that he found and confiscated boxes of Betamax tapes depicting surgical procedures that she was performing on herself and others. I didn't ask about that. I was amazed that anybody could remain conscious while cutting that far into their own body. I left the coroner's office and drove to the old Thompson place, just outside the main town, and I started snooping around. The smell of rot was heavy in the air of the small ranch house. I made my way into the front room and started to look around. I found medical books and magazines about the female reproductive system, postulating over IVF techniques and procedures. I walked into the first doorway I saw, and it had led me to a staircase to the basement. Down there was a stainless steel surgical table and a bunch of surgical equipment, bloodstains on the floor, and large flower pots and bags of soil filled all the free space. Pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together in my head. The overhead fluorescent lighting flickered and buzzed, adding an awful atmosphere to the subterranean space. I walked up to the closest pot, and I used my knife to shuffle around in the soil and inspect the contents of the massive ceramic pot. As I shifted the dirt around, I discovered yet another tiny fetus. This one only had a couple of hair-like roots, and was obviously not doing as well as the first one I had seen. I tried to key my portable radio and call the coroner out, but the reception was so bad I couldn't even make it to dispatch. I decided to climb the stairs and try again. Before I got to the top step, I felt a blinding flash of pain across the back of my head, and I saw lights. Lost my balance and hit the steps, hard. Rolled onto my back and I lost consciousness. But as I did, I saw a figure approaching me. When I awoke, I was naked, strapped to one of the tables in the basement. The lights were still buzzing and flickering, but possibly louder than before. I could hear movement, but I couldn't turn my head to see what it was. As I laid there and took in my surroundings, the buzzings from the lights shifted, and they took on a new quality. It sounded almost like a pair of differently pitched buzzing noises, taking turns making noise. The longer I listened, the more like a conversation it seemed. At some point, the buzzing became less of a priority for me, and my mind wandered. I could still remember that helpless feeling, that instant when I thought I may never see my wife again. My eyes filled with tears and a deep, blinding rage filled my entire being. I gently added pressure to my restraints till I was straining as hard as I could, but I couldn't budge an inch. It was at that exact moment I resigned to my fate. But I decided I wouldn't go easily. I would fight however and whenever I could. I was trying to think of a way to fight out of my situation. Then the sounds of movement got closer. I slowed my breathing and did my best to calm myself, so maybe I'd be able to think a little more clearly. I steeled my resolve, so they say. "Ah, Sheriff, you're awake. Good. I hate to work on a silent piece of meat. So with that in mind, let us begin." A deep, gravelly voice said from just beyond the top of my head. "Go on then, get to it, fuckwit," was my only response. With a slight chuckle, the source of the voice appeared at my side, slowly stepping into view. He was tall and slim, but he looked oddly familiar. I knew I should recognize him, but I didn't know why or from where. I studied his appearance for a moment, as he began to prepare himself with the surgical tools on a tray beside the bed I was tied to. That's when the jackass was done playing with his tools. He turned back to me. He smiled at me with pure hatred. I stared back into his eyes. He straightened his smile and then removed the white lab coat he was wearing. What I saw under the coat, I couldn't fight it. I gagged. There were hunks of him missing. Wherever a piece was gone, Moss and little yellow flowers with 3 petals poked out. Not many, but they were there. I could see things wiggling around under the moss, like his skin was pulsating. "Oh, you like it? Good. Pretty soon, you'll have some just like mine." He laughed as he plunged his hand deep into his abdomen and pulled out, and holding on to several snake or worm-type things. They thrashed against his grip, and even appeared to try to bite him, but his grip never faltered. As they began to reach the wriggling towards my body, I screamed, loud. So loud that I could taste blood at the back of my throat again. I fought against my restraints, this time feeling them stretch and begin to rip, even slightly. I forced against them yet again, and I managed to rip my right arm free. I was able to use my newly freed arm to knock his hand away. I got lucky enough to scatter the things from his grip. When those things hit the floor, the buzzing sound crescendoed to a new level of painful. Now it was a physical feeling of vibration. I fumbled my free hand against the one holding my left arm down, and I managed to free that as well. The half-man, half-plant scurried to the floor to pick up the worms things. They were wiggling away. He dropped to the floor and desperately tried to pick up all of them that he could. The buzzing increased in tempo, and at that time I knew for a fact it was a voice screaming at the things on the floor. I continued to struggle to free myself from the leather straps holding me down to the table. I was able to free my head, one more leg. That's when I heard heavy footsteps from upstairs. Not knowing who or what was coming made the entire situation that much more worse. I struggled to free my other leg, and as soon as I did, I rolled off the table. I hit the floor, hard. I scrambled to hide behind one of the ceramic pots. I waited to see who came down the stairs. I was relieved to see Cooper, the deputy sheriff, and Detective Tolson descending the stairs. Before they were completely down the steps, I yelled to them that there was one subject on the floor in the middle of the room. He was armed and dangerous. Tolson leapt down the final steps and fired 3 shots into the thing crouched on the floor before making his way into the basement room. I stood up and looked around for my clothes. When I couldn't find them, I tried to hide my stuff behind the gurney I had been strapped to. I explained to Tolson and Cooper what happened, and how it came to be that I was currently swinging in the breeze. As I was talking to them, I heard someone thump their fat ass down the steps, and then I heard the coroner's voice. "Are you cold, Sheriff? Choke on a dick. Will you help me find my uniform?" I responded before finishing the description to the pair of officers. "Okay, so how did you guys know to come out here? I haven't been missing that long." "Sheriff," Cooper started, "you've been gone for 33 hours. We actually came out here yesterday to find you. Nobody was here. Just your cruiser still in the driveway. Right before we showed up here today, Miss Thompson's nurse called and said that she swung by to grab her belongings, and there were 2 vehicles in the driveway, and all the locks had been changed. We sped over and only found 1 car in the drive," Tolson continued, "and we haven't been able to find your cruiser yet. Your wife is pretty worried." The coroner wasn't able to find my clothes, or my gun, or even my badge, but he brought me a scrawl from his van, and we collected the evidence in the room. When I shook the dirt off another fetus, Tolson yelled, "Fucking mandrake!" Well, not all the way, but yeah. During our investigation, we discovered hundreds of journals, all from the late Thompson woman, most describing how to go about growing herself a perfect new body. Not a child, but a new body for her. She said multiple times that she had met somebody that could transfer her body to another body, but the new body could have never housed life before. I was just glad she didn't think to cut a full-grown fetus out of a womb. Maybe she thought it wouldn't work. Hell, I don't know. I do know that was the day I bought my wife a CB station. I taught her how to use it. I will never be alone in the field again. There was, however, an interesting occurrence that was unearthed while examining the evidence from the basement. The restraint strap that had held my right arm had been burned, scorched into the worn and wrinkled red leather. A small child's handprint. I think we all know what I believe happened. Alright, but this wasn't one of the better ones, but it still needed to be told. I wanted you all to see that I had garnered the attention of someone in a good way, but this was the first time that she would ever save my ass. Until the next one, I bid thee farewell. Hope the next tale will better satisfy your needs for twisted, awful, gore-riddled danger. Good night, everybody. I would like to apologize for not uploading last week. I got struck with a pretty bad head cold, and no, not the Rona. And I didn't feel like I could upload anything confidently in how it sounds. So, welcome to a new installment of Tales from a Rural Police Officer. As has become our ritual, I wanted to take a moment to address you, the listeners. I wanted to thank you for entertaining an old man, and for all of the love, kindness, and encouragement you've given me. Telling my tales has helped me in a few ways, and more than you could possibly know. Today's tale is an old one. It's from the fall of the year 1999. My little town was severely bitch-smacked by the crazy-ass doomsday preppers, all screaming about the fucking Y2K virus. For those who can't remember, or who weren't born yet, the Y2K or Millennium Bug was a much-feared computer virus. Some folks fully believed that at the strike of midnight, December 31st, 1999, all the computers would error out and crash with the changing of the date. Of course, any asswipe with the slightest bit of sense knew that the threat wasn't real. I had an old IBM computer that I used to organize my home files. I caught rumor of the supposed bug and changed my time and date to see what the computer would do. Guess what it did? Started at January 1st, 2000. Just like every other computer in the world. So, I did my best to tell others that I had proof of the bug being a non-issue. Nobody listened. I was, however, able to prove it to the mayor and the entire courthouse that the bug was not a problem. However, the hardcore preppers, well, they were convinced otherwise. They just knew that the world was going to end at the stroke of midnight. They had all kinds of crazy ideas on how things would crumble to dust. They withdrew cash that they had in the banks and hid it everywhere. Some bought cases of MREs, water, medical survival, antibiotics, and all that shit. They built these amazing bunkers underground and had plans to survive the upcoming digital holocaust. Dispatch received a call Monday morning. Apparently a prepper and his family had left their homestead to gather more supplies and to have a day out, celebrating the life that they had before the bug would erase everything. When they got home, they got to work putting away their newly acquired gear and rations. That was when the mother noticed that the front door of the house, as well as the secret bunker, and the hidden door in the front room, has been forced open, and were all now ajar. The father remained there and sent the wife and the kids to the nearest neighbors to call us. When I arrived, the father, who we will call Terry, was pacing back and forth in the front of the house. He was holding a shotgun and a pistol on his hip. I talked to him for a minute and he told me they hadn't gone in the bunker yet. He was waiting for me, and that he still heard a crash or a thump every now and then. He was relatively sure whomever it was still inside looking through their shit, searching for something. Probably money. I drew my weapon and approached the front door. "Police, come out with your hands up. I will shoot if I have to. Put your hands on your head and walk out slowly," I announced. The thought of having a citizen watch my investigation weighed heavy on my mind. I could now hear the sounds of something moving in the bunker below the home. "Terry, is there another way out?" I asked. I was silently informed that yes, there was indeed another entrance. I motioned for Terry to cover that entrance as I made a loud and clear declaration of deputizing him temporarily and very vocally stating that he had the lawful right to shoot if he felt threatened. I watched as he slowly and carefully made his way to what I thought was a well pump house. He stopped at the door and motioned me to enter the pump house. I stepped over the threshold and could tell this was going to be one of those calls. The ones that I would, some 20-something years later, share with you finely twisted individuals. Entering the house, that feeling of being in danger rushed over me. That feeling that when you're about to die. My heart rate soared, my palms were sweating. Every hair on my body stood on end. It was like I walked into some giant static electric force. Like when you would hold your arm in front of those old tube-style TVs while turning it on or off. It was that kind of staticky feeling. I carefully stepped into the living room and started to walk down the stairs that were built into the floor. I slowly descended the stairs, but couldn't help but admire the work on the bunker. Where most of what I had seen were simple wooden steel buildings, this one was solid cement and well finished. The bright overhead lights cast a brilliant blue light over everything inside. Cases of MREs had been tossed onto the floor and were torn open. They were scattered everywhere. Clothing and other daily items were littered on the floor, and furniture inside the bunker. I swear I could hear heavy breathing, like a 2,000-pound bull was standing right beside me. I slowly walked forward, searching for the obvious intruder or intruders. The bunker was laid out almost exactly like the house above. The stairway I came down landed in what would have been a common living area. Off that was a kitchen, complete with a sink and appliances. The cabinets were all torn open, some doors were even ripped off, and the contents shattered and strewn about the floor. I left the kitchen area and entered a narrow hallway. On each side of the hallway were doors. The breathing was heavier now. I could almost feel it on the back of my neck. I entered the first room and proved to be a young boy's room. Oddly enough, this room seemed perfectly fine. No mess, like whomever was in there ignored this room completely. As I turned to leave the room, the breathing I was hearing was now full blowing against my cheek, like I was eye to eye with whatever it was. I tried to walk out of the room and was thrown across the hall, landing hard against the wall. I never saw what threw me. Not then. I struggled to my feet just in time to get tackled to the ground again. This time, I screamed and punched at the invisible mass or whatever was on top of me. I made solid contact with it. I either heard it or pissed it off, because it roared in my ear. I thought for a moment that it ruptured my eardrums, the fucker. I managed to fumble around with my gun until I was pointing center at the invisible mass. I fired 3 shots directly into the being, and I felt it jerk violently each time. Hot blue-colored fluid rushed into view as it left the body of whatever was on top of me. I was now covered in this thing's blood. It thrashed around violently as it beat the ever-living fuck out of me. I squirmed out from underneath the thing as I scrambled to my feet. I stood there, looking at the growing stain on the floor. There must have been 4 gallons of this blue fluid now on the floor, as I kicked the invisible thing for good measure. I heard a door open, and heard someone run towards me. I turned around with my weapon raised, just in time to see Terry, staggering and running towards me. He had been pretty badly beaten. He was bloody and swollen. His left eye was shut and his bottom lip was busted open. He looked the way I felt. What the hell happened, Terry? He told me about his encounter with a similar invisible beast, how it jumped in from behind and he managed to blow a chunk of it off with the shotgun before it ran off, leaving a trail of blue-colored liquid. I turned back to the growing stain on the floor. As it grew, the outline of the figure became visible. It was about 8 feet tall and 3.5 feet wide. Its skin was a mixture of pale green and gray. It was absolutely hairless, but it did have 8 spikes sticking out of its back. They were laying down, flaccid. It didn't have a neck. It went straight from shoulder to head. Terry and I approached the massive being and rolled it over onto its back. Its face was split vertically, with 24 protruding sharp teeth. It had 4 eyes, 2 large and 2 small, with the large one on top, small directly underneath that. I used the barrel of my handgun to poke at the massive mouth. When the barrel touched the teeth, they would twitch and poke back at the metal, the same way a person's fingers twitch after their death. I asked Terry what the fuck he had that these things could be after. They most likely didn't come for cash. The smell of cat piss and feces was growing with the stain, so Terry and I left the bunker to inspect the house. The house appeared to match the condition of the bunker, with personal belongings and shit laying everywhere. The overwhelming smell of ammonia and feces was even more powerful up here. Terry said something about it following a statement, with something about the reason being he couldn't let the kids have a cat. He couldn't handle the smell. The 2 of us decided it was best to leave out the bit of these things being invisible while they were alive. We decided it would be better that way. I radioed the coroner and told him to bring help. The bastard was upset that he was in the middle of a golf game, and I told him to leave now, not after his game. I knew Terry was hiding something, I just had no clue what it could be. Those things were not there for a fun day at the beach. They were obviously looking for something. I never officially closed the case, and about 6 months after that, I was called to the address yet again. This time, the oldest boy came home and found his entire family dead. They had been eviscerated. He had been with his friends and his friends' parents, so we didn't even have a suspect. This was around the time that an official government branch opened up an office in the next county over. Something about paranomalies. Weird dude, but good at what he did. I wonder whatever happened to those guys. After yesterday's tale of invisible asshats rummaging through Terry's place, today I want to take a moment to delve into the minds of a select few local citizens. This tale will still hold twisted paranormal supernatural events, ones that you've all come to love and read, but this will also show the darker side of the natural human mind and beyond. Living in the country, or the boondocks, brings its own sort of challenges. It also attracts the best and the worst humanity has to offer. This particular tale will dive into this issue, as well as diving into these personality traits that attract themselves. It's not all southern charm and love, let me tell you. To begin with, being isolated and living in the hills brings its own challenges. Fuck, until recently, my own town didn't even have its own grocery store. We had two choices for grocery shopping. One, you go to local mom and pop shop and pay like 3 times the normal price. Or 2, you go to a neighboring county to a real market and get about a month's worth of groceries at once. Another problem we had was before the internet was really a common thing. The supply lines for machine parts, auto parts, and stuff like that, they were shit. Simple shit. Would take a few weeks to get to us. Simply because we had to order it from someone who had to order it from someone who... you get the idea. It sucked balls. Now, on the other side of this coin, the fact that the closest neighbors are still, to this day, about a 30-minute walk away. I can stand naked on my porch and not a soul can see my shame. It's wonderful. Yet, it also means that emergency help is not within range to be useful. For that reason, our emergency services used to be set up pretty differently than most places. For example, we had one fire department that had 8 trucks, 4 tanker trucks, 4 hydrant hook trucks. We would send them to different parts of the county, so that we could at least make a half-assed attempt at being useful. We did the same with our ambulances and even the police force. I was eventually assigned to a satellite office outside of the town that had jurisdiction over the town and the entire county. We had 5 satellite offices, and the main sheriff's office, which is the one with the tiny jail cells. We had to spread the force pretty thin to make sure everybody had equal access to our services. I was designated to the eastern quadrant of the county, and as the sheriff, I was also the interim police chief. During my off hours, my wife and I would volunteer for a program like Hands for Humanity. We helped the lowest income families keep their homes up to par. We would patch holes in the floor and the roofs, even build porches, add stuff like that. Basically, helping the community. We didn't go through any organization. I would see a place while on duty, and my wife and I would pick up a couple of things every weekend to help. This particular weekend, my wife was under the weather. Her cancer hadn't been discovered yet, and the poor dear just believed it was a bad period. So, she wasn't able to help out that weekend. I'm very glad for that. I managed to keep a majority of the paranormal shit away from her. I always figured that if she was not involved, she'd be better off. Sometimes I wonder if I made the wrong decision. Anyway, I was working on the old man's porch one day, replacing rotten steps. As I worked, he made fresh lemonade and homemade BLT sandwiches that were only made from the ingredients he grew, even the bread. It was the best sandwich I've ever eaten. I just finished up the steps and patched a few boards on the porch. The place went quiet. The normal sounds of nature went deadly silent. If you've ever been in the wilderness, you would know that it's never quiet, unless there's a major predator present. Sheriff, I think it's best we come inside for now. Shit's gonna get weird here for a few minutes, the old man said. His voice was low, slow, and hard, like a seasoned vet in combat. Just the tone of his voice made me take him seriously. The man had lived in the hard country his entire life. In 70 plus years, he was scared. It made me take notice. I watched nervously as the old man walked into his smokehouse. I watched him remove what appeared to be an entire smoked lamb and laid it in the yard, directly in front of the big living room window. I couldn't help but think about how badly I needed to fix those leaky windows. Come on, damn it. Get your rear in gear, Sheriff. We ain't got much time now. Get it together, man. He snapped as he made his way up the new steps into the house. I gathered my tools and put my hands on my 357. I mean, iron goes with everything, right? I followed the man into the small house. He sat himself in an old recliner and motioned for me to sit in another chair directly next to him. The way we were sitting, we were both facing the window. We could plainly see the yard beyond. Be quiet. Do not, under any circumstance, make any noise. I don't think we can hold it off for long. Let it eat and shut the hell up. He told me. Something in his eyes made me think that it was real, and he was a little scared. His cold blue eyes, sharp as razors, darting back and forth across the tree line opposite the yard, reminded me of my own eyes during hold-offs and gunfights. I knew that look. The look of not only fear, but pure and solid determination to survive, to come out on top. I had no doubts that this old man could probably whoop some ass if needed. "What is it? What's out there?" I asked, whispering as low and quietly as possible. My words barely made a sound as they left my mouth. I watched the old man's face when he was trying to describe the thing, but as luck would have it, he didn't need to speak. The creature, for what was the only fitting word for it, was gigantic. It was about 10 feet tall and probably 400 plus pounds. I won't say it was Bigfoot, but shit, if there ever was a Bigfoot, it was this motherfucker. Long brown fur hair hung from its entire body. Large brown eyes set deep into its skull. I am sure it was a he. He could put a few horses to shame, actually. His mouth was wide and he has thick lips. I could see the razor-sharp canine teeth poking out of his lips as he snarled at the cabin. I swear to you, this motherfucker locked eyes with me, beat his chest like King fucking Kong. At that moment, I decided to call him King Dong, a name earned by nothing but the grace of God. We watched as it slowly came forth from the trees. He tipped his head back and took deep breaths, looking for the source of what he was smelling. He snapped his head to the location of the meat and launched his furry ass over there. We watched silently as this thing fucking devoured the entire lamb, bones and all. It was impressive and frightening. When King Dong finished eating, he locked eyes with me and beat his fist into his chest again. I knew I was watching, and he knew I was watching. He was pissed. He stood there staring at me, and he took a massive shit right where he stood. When his gigantic turds finished falling, he pointed at them and then at me. And I swear to God, this fucking thing laughed at me. After his little insult, the beast lumbered back into the forest. Within a few moments, we began to hear the sounds of nature again. After about 10 minutes of silence, the old man spoke. "That was Biggin. He shows up once or twice a month, eats whatever I leave out for him, and then takes off. The first time he came around, I didn't know to leave meat out. He ate my hogs, all 3 of them. I figured a hunk of beef or sick lamb would keep him happy, and keep the other critters safe." What other critters? That was the first animal I've seen here today. Where and what's your stock?" The old man's eyes softened, and he glanced down at the floor. "Well, I think Biggin has a mate. A big old bitch beast came here a few weeks ago and cleaned me out. Biggin must have heard the animal screaming because he rushed out of the woods and ran to the pens. They growled and smacked at each other. He gestured to the house and then the smokehouse, then the dead animals. The bitch beast looked over towards here, bellowed and tossed a half-dead pig at the driveway before walking into the woods. Biggin stood there staring at her with his mouth open for a few minutes, before wandering into the woods with her. I just haven't managed to get the cash together to replace him yet," the old man said and stared out the window. He brought out some moonshine and offered me a shot. I wasn't on duty and took a sip. We talked for a few hours about the beast and how he feels responsible to the community for keeping their appetites satiated. We talked about life, love, and death. He spoke of his wife, now gone, and his son, also gone. Then he talked about living up here. In the head of that hollow was his destiny. He felt that he was needed by the beast to help feed him. I eventually went home and took care of my wife. I didn't tell her about the beast. The finger plant on the table was enough to wrap her for days. This would really fuck her up. I just let it simmer in the back of my mind. A few months later, the old man passed. My wife and I were the only ones to attend his funeral. I've taken up his job feeding them once or twice a month. I leave a smoked hog out in the clearing, just in case. There are never any bones or scrap of meat left when I go back. Hello, dear readers. I'm sorry I've been away for a while, but life has a way of making plans unmanageable. Now, instead of talking about one of my cases today, I thought I'd discuss my town, and some of the more harmless but still pretty odd things that happen here. Now, not everything that I'm going to describe is still happening, nor will everything be exactly harmless. Let me begin this breakdown of the town by saying that I have personally witnessed each of these events, at least once. I've tried to trace through the origin of each one. However, I haven't been able to prove or disprove the possibility that these things were caused by supernatural beings or situations. For starters, let me tell you about how the city sewer system is basically alive. Well, that's a drastic oversimplification. The sewers don't breathe or move, but they do eat. Our town has its own water treatment plant, so the city does have an idea of what should be floating into the treatment plant. However, once or twice a month, the only thing that floats in is plain, clear, clean water. It's still treated, of course, because, we tried sending guys into the network to inspect and make certain there were no breaks in the tiles and stopping breaches. 4 guys went in. 1 came out. 2 weeks later, 3 dive suits washed onto the plant, empty and unharmed. Then there's the fact that every now and then, our fire hydrants like to turn into flamethrowers. Not big flames, just a couple of feet, but hot, like nuclear hell hot. It got to the point where the city removed 75% of the hydrants and brought in tanker trucks to replace them. We lost a pretty good hydrant truck before that decision was made. Or how about the fact that there will occasionally be, for lack of a better term, portals that open up behind the grocery store in town. We never know when they're going to pop up, but we always know after they've opened. The portals themselves usually open up about 20 feet above the level of the roof, and they have a tendency to vomit odd creatures. Fish that flop on the blacktop of the alleyway and bark like dogs, snakes that have legs, and look like giant centipedes, save for the fact that they have rattle buttons. And there's also these bipedal figures that are somewhat human, but they have the face of a deer. The deer-faced people have a tendency to walk into the market and chew on the produce. And of course, they never pay. The portals open and close at random, and to this date we've not managed to learn anything about them, or where they open up to. We tried to send a drone across a few weeks ago, but it got swallowed and digested by something that we couldn't see. Wednesday night, the sidewalks turned sticky like a thick glue substance. They've taken a few citizens. Of course, we can't just take them out, so we close them off every Wednesday afternoon and reopen them Thursday morning. Our town has its fair share of weird shit. Nobody can argue otherwise. We have occasionally dangerous shit. And we have even more common, non-dangerous weird shit. But there are things that have been known to be hostile to some and incredibly docile to others. By this, of course, I mean the sunflowers. Sunflowers? Yeah, sunflowers. They pop up overnight like gigantic mutated dandelions. Some of them have teeth, and others just scream at the sky until they die when the sun goes down. We had a botanist try to come out and examine them once. He was bitten and severely disfigured by one that didn't even appear to initially have teeth. I guess they can just grow teeth at a whim. We have a silent but standing rule. Nobody grows sunflowers of any variety, and when the odd one does pop up, we just avoid them. My entire county has a problem with feral cats as well. And they do appear to be normal cats, but they're simply just fucking huge. Last week, 2 of them attacked the dog pound. They devoured 3 pit bulls and a poodle before they were satiated and fled the scene. We tried to capture them, but they're smart enough to avoid every trap that we tried. Our local animal control officer stated that monthly, he just goes out and kills as many of these big-ass fucks as he sees. Last month, he got like 13 in 2 hours driving around the county. Recently, these cats have been starting to communicate with people. They don't speak, but they have some sort of mental communication type. In short, they are dicks. They're dicks who would tell you the darkest things. This past weekend, one of the cats convinced a 14-year-old girl to stab her mother and then slice her wrists. Her diary was filled with pages and writings about what the cats told her. They convinced her that she wasn't a human child, but a rare breed of ape that was stolen from the zoo by the woman she thought was her mother. This pushed the poor child to murder her mother and then slice her own wrists, just so that she could leave her body that she had been forced into and be free with her family in the forest. The last thing I'll discuss today will be the way that our forests have of dealing with tourists and hunters alike. It's gotten to the point where hunting licenses aren't sold in the county, and licenses from the rest of the state are not valid here. People have vanished and never been seen again. Or even worse, they return and they're not the same. The last hiker that was returned to town was returned without his eyes. Now, they had not been removed in any conventional way. It was as if they were never there to begin with. His skull didn't have eye sockets or passages for the optical nerves. The skin was tightly grown over, and that's where they should have been. The worst and weirdest part about the whole thing, he can still see us, right down to being able to describe what we were wearing. And he was even able to pass an eye exam with slightly better than 20/20 by the chart method. Just weird. Well, folks, I have to cut this one short. I hear a cat in the yard. Gotta make sure that bastard doesn't try to attack my miniature horse again. Until next time, the Sheriff.